Johnson. Thank you for joining us. We're going back international. We're going to have fun with this. A little bit of history, a little bit of quotable quotes, as they would say on Jeopardy. Our friend Sarah Stook from over in England. How are you, ma'am?
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
Thrilled to have you. She writes a lot in the Mallard. And this particular piece is from our friends over at Elections Daily, Eric Cunningham and them. They do great work. We've had them on the show before, and we will continue to work with them. But I love this because it's what I like to do because it intersects news and history and quotes and things like this. But you're writing about the quotes that shook the world, American quotes. What was your criteria when you started to look through this? Because obviously there's a lot of presidential speeches and other affluent Americans. There's a lot of things that have gone into the pulp culture realm. So what was your criteria when you went to put these together?
Well, I limited it to the 20th and 21st century because A, it has more of a spread with radio, television, and social media. And also it's a lot easier to narrow it down because if I had to add quotes from before, I wouldn't necessarily say we would have had the same impact, maybe in America it would, but definitely not worldwide.
What is it, just generally speaking, before we get into the specific instance you do, because you are in England, what is it usually that cuts through to an overseas audience from America? Because we get wrapped up in the day-to-day stuff and kind of more the silliness and the politics. These are big ticket items that burn through. This is like 9/11 and things like this. Nixon resigning was one of them. What kind of events do you see that burn through the media and it becomes a worldwide thing, not just an American thing?
Well, I think it will definitely only be the big stuff, unless you're like me and you pay a lot of attention. For example, Nixon resigning, my parents can't remember that. But Kennedy, I talked to my nana, she remembers the Kennedy death. She said, oh, everyone loved him, etc. And obviously 9/11. But so I'd say it's only the major things. But Trump's definitely been one where everybody remembers it. My parents don't follow American politics particularly closely, but they remember stuff Trump said, and then they say, "Why is Biden so quiet?" So definitely newer with the newer medium, and I think Trump helps that because he was just reported on like no other president ever has been.
Yeah, talking to Sarah Stook. Let's start with one that is famous in history, but it's just on the fringe of living memory, getting ready to pass, and we just had the anniversary of it. FDR's Day of Infamy speech, of course, December 7th, Pearl Harbor. We're almost out of the living folks that can remember that. We're down to just a handful of the veterans of the attack, people that can remember it. When it's something like this, that it's still in living memory, but it's in that gray area where it's almost passed into history. How do you manage the impact of something like that? Because everybody remembers Day of Infamy, perhaps, but it is going into that area where we don't have people that's going to remember it firsthand anymore, and it's going to be a piece of history now.
I think it's definitely, if we go into the pop culture realm, if you think of the Michael Bay film Pearl Harbor, obviously, it's not all about the actual events, it's the whole fictional romance story. But I think that's probably where we will remember it from. And I mean, we didn't really learn about it at school. I assume that you guys probably do. So I
Some
think
it's
it's
hard to get
definitely
away from it. 'Cause
to live down.
well, it's a bit of a generation gap too, because like when I was growing up, my grandparents in that generation, everybody knew a World War II veteran. But like my children, they never got to meet my grandparents, so they don't really know any World War II veterans. So there's definitely a generation jump there when it comes to something like Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's not something that maybe my grandparents, I only have two grandparents left, both, I wouldn't say particularly remember Pearl Harbor. They were probably a wee bit on the young side. So I definitely think I think it's definitely here it will be fewer people remembering it, mainly because it happened in America, but also because that generation probably doesn't remember it as well as maybe people born in the 30s did on your end.
And obviously, that was, Pearl Harbor monumental, World War II. It's been called a cataclysm. It was worldwide. What about some of the quotes that you talk about and speeches that shook the world, but they weren't war related? You talk about something like Nixon resigning. Talk about that one, why that one kind of burns through as one of the quotes that really hit home.
It's quite fascinating, really, because in the past few years, we've had quite a few prime ministers resign: Margaret Thatcher, Tony Blair, David Cameron, Theresa May, likely Boris Johnson, because he is not very popular at the moment. But you've only had one president who's ever resigned. And to me, that's like insane. It's like you guys have had 8 presidents who died in office. We only had one prime minister who was assassinated. It's quite a big difference. But I think it's sort of, I think Kennedy's assassination broke America's innocence, but Nixon's assassination torpedoed the respect and the trust that America had with its politicians. You'll still get people going to see presidents when they come to places, but you won't have the crowds of the Kennedy days, of Eisenhower, and anyone before that. Before then, the president sort of was a hero. Kennedy's affairs were covered up. Everything bad about presidents were covered up, but now we get everything down and dirty. And I think that's partially thanks to Nixon. Because of him, it broke the barrier of innocence that America saw. I mean, Ford got hammered for pardoning Nixon. Whether it was the right thing or not is, consigned to different consensus.
You also talk about kind of that a little before Nixon, but the same general generation thing. You had RFK announcing Martin Luther King Jr. being shot as one of them. And of course, we know that in due course, right after, RFK himself was assassinated. Those are always kind of linked in the American consciousness. But that's part of that generation you're talking about, where of course we have mass media now, we have TV now, national media at that time period in the late 60s. These things all combine to really make those kind of searing events that go into people's minds. And it really did show people, it's like, look, these are not just glossy news headlines. This is real life stuff, and that loss of innocence you were talking about.
Yeah.
Why did you go with the RFK one, announcing MLK? Was it because of his own assassination, or was it just because his stature and being Kennedy's brother? Why do you think that one hit so well?
Well, he did his speech when he was in Indianapolis, and it was one of the few major US cities who didn't see major riots after that happened. And he was credited with calming their nerves and creating the peace. And I think it was it was pretty much off the cuff. And that's pretty impressive because it's a beautiful speech.
Yes.
And I don't think we've had many presidents or presidential candidates who are brilliant speakers, but Robert Kennedy had a gift. I think his brother did as well, but maybe even more so with Bobby, because I think he was a lot more self-assured on the issue of civil rights compared to JFK. It sort of took him a bit of time, whereas Kennedy was straight on that. So I think that self-assurance and just how he delivered it in the moment, because these people who were speaking to, they didn't know that had happened. Again, like you said, this is the day before, CNN wasn't founded until 1980 with the whole 24-hour news. There was no social media, no internet. He was their first line of defense. He was the first to say that had happened.
Yeah, you mentioned him a minute ago. You also, Gerald Ford made the list, a president that's kind of got a bit of a mixed legacy. Everybody remembers he kind of fell on his sword over the Nixon era. He kind of gets that reputation. People know him as a good and decent man, but they don't really remember a lot about his presidency himself. But you put in his quote about "My fellow Americans, our long national nightmare is over." Just set that up for folks that maybe have never heard that one or don't remember, because we don't talk about Gerald Ford as much as other presidents, because it seemed like he was there for a cup of coffee and that was it. But talk about that quote and its significance and what was going on around that time.
Well, obviously Nixon had just resigned and Gerald Ford had taken over. So prior to Gerald Ford being vice president, Spiro Agnew was forced to resign. So Republican leaders met and said, okay, we'll give you Gerald Ford because everybody likes him. He's one we can all agree on. So obviously when Nixon resigned, it was down to Gerald Ford. And Gerald Ford was saying, I'm going to heal the nation. It's going to be different. Which was, I don't think it was a lie necessarily, because, okay, it didn't happen. But I genuinely thought he wanted to keep the peace and thought he was maybe going to be able to, which is why he definitely crossed wires when it came to pardoning Nixon, because on the one hand it saved the nation from a long tiring investigation, but also let Nixon get off scot-free, which I think a lot of people didn't particularly like. And to this day people are a lot more forgiving of Ford for what he did, but I imagine back then they weren't that happy about it.
In the moment, compared to 2020 hindsight of history, Ford's gotten a little bit better deal than he probably got in the moment. We're talking to Sarah Stook. We've been talking about some past incidences from her article in elections-daily.com, 20 American quotes that shook the world. We're going to take a quick break, more with her, and we're going to talk about some recent stuff. Quite a lot of them made her list, recent events and recent politicians, and we'll cover that on Her Tell right after this. Back on Her Tell, I'm Andrew Donaldson. We're talking to Sarah Stook from over in England. Her piece that I just adore, these kind of little history nuggets, 20 American quotes that shook the world. We've been talking about some of the ones in the past, December 7th, Pearl Harbor, Nixon, RFK, MLK. You had quite a few of these that were pretty much in the modern era, though, didn't you?
Yeah, I thought it's definitely important because these obviously came with a time where media was quicker, where information came quickly, but we think of history as long ago. But as I was saying to my parents the other day, in history class, I would have learned about stuff that they were alive during. So, history is anything that's happened before this moment. It's stuff that kids and grandkids will learn about. So I think it was equally important to discuss what's happening today than in our grandparents' generation.
Have one of the more famous ones of the last generation or so, Reagan telling Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Of course, it was a couple of years later before that wall actually came down, but it's certainly in European history and in the world order. Talk about that for a moment, because that's another one that was real recent history, and now it's not. It's been a generation since then, 35 years.
My father was a guard briefly on the Berlin Wall.
Oh, really?
So, he was stationed in Germany, he's ex-military. Definitely more European history. Obviously, the Cold War affected the whole world, but it was sort of the European theatre, apart from, pigs invasion, etc. And first of all, it was a great soundbite because it's so easy to remember. Nobody else remembers the rest of the speech. They just remember that little bit, which I think is important. You don't need to know all the details. You just need to remember that specific bit. Reagan was one of the best communicator presidents, mainly down to his acting history. So when he said it, and he said it with such conviction and sincerity that it was as though he was talking to Gorbachev face to face, telling these East Berliners, one day, hopefully you will be free. And it's one of the most remembered quotes because it signified sort of the end of the Cold War. But would a president have spoken that bluntly and maybe even that kindly 20 years earlier? It signified a thaw in relations that came under Gorbachev.
Yeah, and then of course for growing up in the 80s and 90s, that was a big deal. But the next one that's chronologically on your list, 1998, Bill Clinton. That's a meaningful one for me because 1998 was the first election I got to vote in. I turned 18 that year. I graduated high school that year. That was kind of my introduction to politics, was the Clinton years. So I know this one really well. But the now, I would say this one's infamous more than famous, but I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky, and he's pointing right at the camera. And everybody knew at the moment he was lying. And we know for a fact now that he was indeed lying. But that was one of the quotes that hit your list. Explain that one to folks.
If I want to make you feel very old, I was born in 1998. Was that quite January?
Well, it was in the deposition, so it was released after he actually said it. So yeah, because it was
I was born in March 98. So
yeah, it was a videotaped deposition, if I remember correctly. But yeah, that is not helping you telling me that though. But go ahead. Why is that one so meaningful? Because we talked a little bit about Nixon breaking innocence. Whatever innocence was left to the office of the presidency, this probably finished it off. Yeah.
Well, it's because it's such a pop culture reference. I don't know if any of your viewers have watched the latest series about it, Broken Crime Story. I do recommend It's a really good series because it's just so memeable. You can just say if it was on The Simpsons, for example, I mean, it might have been, I don't know, everybody would recognize it because it's my generation certainly knows about Bill Clinton. And I think it's down to the Me Too era. When it happened, Monica Lewinsky was basically a sacrificial lamb at the altar of the media. Liberal feminists like Gloria Steinem basically called her a slut and said all sorts of horrid things about her. She was 22 years old. She was just about my age when that happened. Yet they were horrific about her. Yeah, I mean, yeah, she had an affair with a married man, and I'm not going to say she was completely blameless. But he was old enough to be her father, and she was an intern. He was the president of the United States. And it's more impactful now in the Me Too movement because people are starting to realize how wrong Bill Clinton actually was and how Monica Lewinsky was definitely more of a victim than she was any of the names that they called her when it originally happened.
Yeah, it was an ugly piece of history. And then not even 2 years later, we had another ugly for a different reason, and it made your list. But the 2000 election between George W. Bush and Al Gore. I don't know that a lot of people know this quote. They know what it's about, but I don't think this is really well known in the States. So you let me set it up for you. But it's the Supreme Court decision, and I'll quote it: "The judgment of the Supreme Court of Florida is reversed, and the case is remanded for further proceedings not inconsistent with this opinion." You did the quote, which I don't think maybe people still to this day haven't heard it, but what that quote meant changed a whole lot of things in a big hurry, didn't it?
Well, I thought it was such an important piece of history, but there was no specific quote that really, everyone remembers. So I thought, the best one is the Supreme Court decision. And there's a really good documentary about it called, it was However Many Votes Was in It, and it's about the Cubans in Florida and how it influenced the election. That is a very good documentary if you ever get around to it. It was even more contentious than the 2016 election when Hillary won the popular vote, but Trump got the Electoral College because it went down to the Supreme Court. I mean, I'm not sure. I don't think it's particularly easy to get cases in front of the Supreme Court, but I think that's definitely understandable that did. Was it going to be a continuation of the sort of the Clinton dynasty, or was there going to be a resurgence with the Bush Republicans? And certainly, I think it was down to Gore. He sort of cut himself off from Clinton. He disapproved of the affair. He wanted to be his own man. Had he piggybacked on Clinton's popularity, he probably would have won. But he didn't choose to do that, and that was his folly.
Yeah. And then just another year later, another one that made the list, 9/11, George Bush announcing that, man, you got 3 of your 20 within about a 4-year span of time. That's a lot of history jammed in tight. And of course, we know 9/11, the attacks of September 11th, world changing stuff. Why did you go with this particular quote out of, several pieces of pop culture things that have lived on from there?
Because I think, well, again, sorry to make you feel old, I was only 3 when this happened, so I have no memory of it. My mum was at home and my dad was working away, and I want to say he was in Sudan, so he found out about it that way. That I don't think any event in my lifetime has impacted the world like 9/11 has. The wars, everything that came with it, Patriot Act, it's such an amazingly horrific event that has changed so much of the world. And George Bush, he was at the height of his popularity after that had happened. Whatever you think about the man, he handled it very well as one can in such horrendous circumstances. His quote about America being attacked, because, my grandparents, they lived through the IRA generation in Britain up until the 1990s. And I mean, it still happened sporadically. You had attacks. It was people lived with it, bomb threats. Whereas on mainland soil in America, yes, you had maybe the Oklahoma bombing, but such attacks and 3,000 people in one attack is terrific amount. They thought it would be higher. I remember watching video clips and thinking, it could be 10,000 people dead. And I just think it's such a monumental, we just passed a 20-year anniversary, monumental event that it had to be in there because America was under attack. Yeah. Well, yeah, because it was a terrorist attack.
Yeah, and I was on active duty military at the time, so I promise you that our lives changed in a big hurry. I'm talking like I saw the second tower hit, and by the time I got up the stairs and got my uniform on, the phone's ringing, and we're we're off doing it by that afternoon, and the world changed in a hurry. So definitely that one. And finally, to kind of wrap this up, her piece, Sarah Stook, we're talking to. This is so much fun for people that do culture and politics to kind of take a minute and go through the history. 20 American quotes that shook the world. It's in elections-daily.com, which is a great website. Good friends of ours. One that has definitely been the predominant background noise for the last 5-6 years now. You had Hillary Clinton conceding to Donald J. Trump the presidency, which he won in 2016. It sure changed the discourse. It sure changed a lot of how people viewed politics. It changed how the media covers politics. But let's get your perspective. We've already established you're young and I'm old. So you tell me, from over yonder to where we are, why did you pick that one? Why is it so meaningful?
Well, it was my first year of university. It was in my second month of university. I was 18, so if I was American, it would have been my first vote. The Brexit vote which was my second ever vote, was only a few months prior to that. 2015, obviously, he announced it. Everyone was like, okay, it's just a bit of an attention seeker. Ha ha ha, la la la. That's what I think one would expect, I vaguely knew who Donald Trump was. I'm sure it's definitely more popular with the Americans. I think I'd heard of him from friends. So everyone thought it was a bit of a joke. It was going to be, Jeb Bush or Ted Cruz. And then he started to win, and everyone was like, oh, this is completely different. So I remember election night very, very well. It was, obviously, we stayed up really late because massive time difference. It was about 5-6 o'clock before I went to bed. We all had a massive load of us went to a bar. And when Florida was announced, like the whole room was like, you had like these Russian guys cheering, and then these clearly liberal girls in shock. Everyone was like, oh my God, I can't believe it. I wish I'd bet on it now, because after Brexit happened, I thought, I think he's got a chance. I wish I'd bet on it. I would have made some money. Sadly, I didn't. But everyone was just so shocked. I mean, Donald Trump, who did politics as a hobby, versus Hillary Clinton, who has been in public eye for, long as he has, but for different reasons. And it was it a break in the establishment? Was it? It could have been, because everyone expected it to make history. Hillary Clinton had a giant glass ceiling that was going to shatter in her New York hub. I still think, I'm still in shock that he actually won 5 years later.
Yeah.
And I think probably America is as well. But obviously that has changed with the election of Mr. Biden.
Yeah. I joke about it because I was in hospital from August through November that year. And I joke, like, man, I came off a ventilator and the Chicago Cubs are in the World Series and Donald Trump's president. What have you people been doing? A little facetiously. I was watching most of that on TV. But yeah, it was a monumental thing. It was a surprising thing. And it's been, I think, for people to do news and politics like we do, it's kind of been the dominant thing for the last 5 or 6 years. So it's definitely meaningful. Sarah Stook, this is fantastic. I love this piece. Thank you for writing it and for sharing your perspective on it. It's always fun to get our overseas friends to give a little distance view of us Americans and how we can be a little silly with things. But this is a great little chunk of history. Let people know where they can follow you and find your work and get more from you in the future.
So my Twitter is Sarah underscore Stook, STOOK. You can find me. I'm assistant editor for a UK publication called The Mallard. So if you can find me on there. I was also employed by Sky News, but this was a couple of years ago. So if you search my name on YouTube, possibly come up. I tend to write more about American politics and history because it's more of my interest. There you will find my views on British and other countries. I'm hoping to write a British version of this article for quotes like from Margaret Thatcher, Tony Blair, and Nigel Farage, to name a few.
Yep.
So hopefully continue reading my work, and it was a pleasure to be on here.
I'll go out on a limb and say there may be a Churchill quote somewhere in there, just since we spent a long time quoting him.
I started writing it. I think it's about 5 on there. And I was like, might as well get him out of the way because he's done all the good ones.
Yeah, there's other British people, but he sure looms large. We will definitely have you back, especially with some of the fun. You alluded to our friend Boris Johnson having a rough go of it, so I'm sure we're going to be talking to our British friends a lot in the coming year. Thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much.